Welcome to another wonderful Susannah Calloway audiobook. We are excited to have you with us. Before we begin the story, please like and subscribe to our channel and share it with friends. This allows us to continue adding free clean Western romance audiobooks for you to enjoy. The following title is copyrighted by Susannah Calloway, Western romance author. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and enjoy the story. The Mayor's Forced Marriage. Chapter 1. The 1st of October's a fine time to be starting a project that will run for 6 months, isn't it? Nothing could possibly go wrong. Pete Danvers' tone was more than a tad sarcastic. From anyone else, the words would have made Daniel a little hot under the collar, but he'd been friends with Pete since they were boys, and he knew it was just his way. Besides, he rather agreed with him. Oregon winters started early and hit hard. It was difficult to imagine a worse time to break ground on a hotel. He turned away from his view of the big saw, raising an eyebrow at Pete. "It's just a matter of plannin' the trees Mr. Rowland cut down this summer. Better to mill 'em now than after they're sogged up in the rain. I reckon he knows well enough to wait until the snows have come and gone." Pete grinned at him. He was a friendly man of about 30 years. Roughly the same age as Daniel Cross himself. But where Pete was tow-headed and rather broad and bluff, Daniel was tall and slim. The wiriness of his frame had always been easy enough to conceal when he was at the saw himself, dressed in a set of coveralls. Now that he was more in the habit of wearing three-piece suits, much to his chagrin, it was more difficult to look like anything but what he was, the boss. Why, if someone who didn't know him came along, they were liable to think he'd never done a day's hard work in his life. The way he was tricked out nowadays. Somewhat enviously, he eyed Pete's grease-stained coveralls. He couldn't help but long for the simple days when life had been about felling and cutting and milling, and not politics. But the simple days were long gone, and he was too deep into things to change his mind now. Besides, this isn't Roland's first rodeo, he went on. He handled the construction of the new bank just fine last year. True. But this is a much bigger job, Pete pointed out, pushing his hat back to scratch his forehead. A 5-story hotel. The first of its kind in the whole of North Oregon. Sure, but it's still just a hotel. Ain't like he's trying to build Buckingham Palace. Daniel chuckled. Matter of fact, all he's got to do is build 2 regular hotels and stack one on top of the other. Pete shook his head, but he was chuckling too at the thought. "This is why you and I stick to milling the wood, I guess," he said. "Leave the building to folks like Robert Rowland." He nudged his employer in the ribs. "Of course, pretty soon you won't be here to keep an eye on me all day. You'll have more important things to think about." The thought sobered Daniel immediately. "I'll always have time for the mill," he said. "That's so? In between running this town like clockwork, not to mention taking care of a new bride?" He chuckled. "My faith in your abilities is near boundless, Daniel, but I reckon even you might slip up now and then, trying to juggle all that." Daniel couldn't help but wince. His friend, who knew him well, caught the expression. "Now, don't tell me you're still having second thoughts about all this." "Daniel, Point Harrow needs you. There ain't anyone else around here who could step into the mayor's shoes. Not like you can. This little town has grown too big for its britches, and too quick for its health. We're all wobbling around like a newborn colt trying to stand for the first time. We need a steady hand on the tiller." Daniel pressed his lips together. Despite the heavy burden of his concerns, Pete's wanton litany of metaphors meant he had to fight against smiling. But smiling during times of serious gravity, he suspected, was hardly mayoral. "I'll always have time for the mill," he said again, and clapped Pete on the shoulder. "I'd best be off and see how Ma is doing this afternoon. Keep an eye on that giant oak, would you? I reckon of all the trees Mr. Rowland has cut down, that's the largest. It'll give us near 1,000 board feet, or I miss my guess." "I reckon you're right. I'll keep an eye out, make sure the men do it right. After all, that's my job, Daniel, don't forget. And my job is to do my job, so's you can go and do yours." The two men nodded at each other. It was an effortless sort of understanding, built from years of knowledge and association, compounded by working together. As Daniel left the mill behind and headed back home on horseback, he couldn't help but wish that everyone could communicate in such an easy fashion. But that, he knew, was nothing but a dream. Far too much to ask. The town was one thing. He'd grown up here, and it was beloved to him. All of Point Harrow, Oregon, which was considerably more than it had been 31 years ago when he'd arrived on the scene, was as familiar to him as the back of his own hand. And Pete was right, the town was growing in leaps and bounds and needed someone to guide it. Someone with both an understanding of the past and a firm eye on the future. If he wasn't so convinced of the importance of the role of mayor, the necessity for it, he would never have given up so much of his time at the mill. His father had started it, 3 years before Daniel had been born, and it was as integral a part of his life as his own reflection. He could not imagine someone else taking over, or the sign above the mill being repainted. Cross Mills it had been named on the day it had opened, and Cross Mills it would remain while Daniel had breath in his body. He couldn't fathom leaving the running of the mill entirely to someone else, not even Pete. He was willing to sacrifice a great deal for Point Harrow, but not that. Thankfully, that had not been one of the stipulations put to him by the town council, when they'd asked him to consider running for mayor. As for the stipulations they had insisted on, he heaved a sigh at the thought. That was the real cause for concern, on the matter of communication. How on earth was he supposed to take on the additional role of husband, in the midst of all this? And married to a woman who was a complete stranger, to boot. But when the council had come to him, they had made it clear that they expected their new mayor to be as much a man of tradition as the last man to hold the office. He sighed again. The last man to hold the office, namely Joseph McGraw, had been 88 years old when he died and finally relinquished the role. Folks around these parts tended to see unquestioning loyalty as a virtue. No one else had ever even run against him as mayor, as far as Daniel knew. McGraw had pretty much been guaranteed the job for life, and what a life it had been. A father, a grandfather, and a great-grandfather. Certainly, no businessman. It wasn't that Daniel objected to the idea of being married, not at all. He knew his mother would like to have a daughter-in-law, and grandchildren too, someday. And he knew that most men his age already had a passel of little ones running around their feet and drooling on the furniture. But, he'd been busy. Too busy to think about settling down. He wouldn't have given it a second thought, if not for the fact that council insisted. If he wanted them to back his bid for mayor, he'd been told, he had a total of 60 days in which to find a wife. 20 of those days had already elapsed, but his bride-to-be was already on her way here, all the way from Connecticut. Ironic, really, he was a man of relative fortune, relative youth, with a strong conscience and an honest mind, someone who would live and die for the benefit of the town in which he'd been raised. And yet, he couldn't find a woman who was willing to consider marrying him anywhere within 2,500 miles. That wasn't entirely the truth of the case, of course, and he had to admit it in his own defense. As quickly as Point Harrow was growing, it was almost entirely populated by families with young children and bachelors with no children at all. Single women of marriageable age were few and far between, and none of them had caught his fancy, nor that of the town council. And Marsh of Connecticut it was. Their marriage had been arranged by a matrimonial agency in Hartford, and he had to trust their word that Miss Marsh was everything he was looking for in a bride, or, rather, everything the council was looking for. For her own sake, he hoped she was adaptable and resilient. For himself, he dreamed of nothing more than pleasant companionship and a ready helpmeet as he worked to guide the town without losing the mill. His home was not far from the lumber yard, just inside the town proper of Point Harrow. He smiled fondly at the familiar sight as he rode into the yard, slipping from the saddle and handing the reins over to Michael, his mother's errand boy. Daniel's father had built the home in which he'd raised his only son, built it from the first load of lumber ever planed at the mill. Every board, every nail had been placed with love and craftsmanship, and Daniel felt as though his father's legacy looked down on him each time he came home. His mother, still a sprightly and energetic woman in her late 60s, met him just inside the door. There was an unaccustomed tremor in her hands as she reached for him briefly. "Oh, Daniel, there you are. I was starting to think I ought to send Michael after you. He blinked at her, puzzled, even as he followed her into the kitchen. Bernice Cross ran the entire house, with minimal help from a small occasional staff, but the kitchen was her haven, and the friendliest, most comfortable room in the entire place. The warm October day was drawing to a close, with an autumnal bite already in the air, and the warmth of the fire was welcome. He took a seat on the hearth, stretching his long legs out in front of him, and she handed him a glass of lemonade. I'm not so late, am I? Is something wrong, Ma? She reached for a piece of folded paper on the table and handed it to him, her eyes meeting his only briefly before she turned her gaze away. I read it, she said. I'm sorry, Daniel, I was just so excited that there was news, and I. He unfolded the paper and read the telegram over once, twice. There wasn't much to read, telegrams were expensive, and the sender was evidently not a man of means, judging by his sparse words. The Reverend Mr. Albertson of Silver Creek, Nevada, did not even waste words on condolences. And Marsh had contracted a bad case of influenza on her trip west and had passed away suddenly. Her parents had been notified. Amidst her papers was the contract between herself and Daniel, hence the Reverend's telegram to inform him of the same. Daniel couldn't shake the sense that the Reverend disapproved of the arrangement. In truth, he couldn't blame him for it either. If the contract from the matrimonial agency had led, directly or inadvertently, to Miss Marsh's death. He let out a long, slow sigh and looked up at his mother, who gazed at him with compassion in her green eyes. She stepped forward and took the telegram from him, putting a hand on his shoulder at the same time. I'm sorry, son. But it isn't your fault. It isn't anyone's fault. Daniel shook his head. His heart was numb and still. I guess not. I feel guilty anyhow. His mother regarded him for a moment, then said, quietly, yes, I'm sure you will. That's the sort of man you are, and exactly the reason why Point Harrow needs you for its leader. Daniel rubbed a hand through his dark hair. That doesn't matter. Of course it does. You would never have signed a contract with that agency if the council hadn't insisted that you marry before you take office. If it's anyone's fault, it's theirs, and I'll tell that Ronald Briggs myself. Despite the conflicted feelings that filled him, Daniel grinned as he shook his head again. No, Ma, let's leave Ron out of it. He doesn't mean any harm. Perhaps not, but he's caused it, all the same. No, you were right the first time. It isn't anyone's fault. He stood up. I'd best go and send a telegram to the agency, and to her parents, too. He thought a moment and gave a slight grimace. And I ought to wire a few dollars to the Reverend, too, for his trouble. He's a man of God, isn't he? Well, let God reimburse him for a telegram or two. Daniel leaned down to press a kiss to the top of his mother's head. You're all full of fire today, aren't you? She sank back into the chair he had just vacated, the folded telegram clutched in her hand. I don't know, son, she said, her voice fading. Sometimes, it seems we can't win for losing. You'll feel better tomorrow, Ma. It's just the bad news, that's all. He left her there, in her comfortable, cozy kitchen, and left the house again. The afternoon had been cut short, with a chilly evening descending abruptly, and there were few people out and about as the breeze picked up and everyone rushed home to supper. Daniel took his time, knowing that George at the post office would still be on duty behind his desk, waiting for any last-minute telegrams to come through. He breathed in the cold night air, reveling in the beauty of his little town, despite the tumultuous happenings of the past hour. He couldn't rightly mourn poor Miss Marsh. He hadn't so much as met the woman, after all, and knew nothing of her apart from what the matrimonial agency had told him. But he did feel sorry for her, and his compassionate heart felt for her parents, too. As for what her imminent arrival had meant to him, well, he would think about that tomorrow. If Briggs and the rest of the council refused to listen to reason and accept that a bachelor could be a competent mayor just as well as a married man, then he'd just have to figure something else out. But not tonight. Tonight, once he sent off the requisite telegrams, he would set the whole matter aside and think of more pleasant things, like the way the grand old oak was being planed, the grain golden and beautiful even without all the finishing touches that would come later on. With this thought in mind, he turned down the street that led to the post office. It was pure chance, nothing but happenstance, that he happened to glance across the street, through the gathering dusk. There, seated on the bench in front of Edna Fuller's boarding house, sat a stranger. She was striking, obviously a handful of years younger than Daniel himself, but with a presence and gravity carried in a pair of wide-set gray eyes that made him go suddenly still, his mission momentarily forgotten. Her head was turned, revealing a delicate profile, delicate, yes, but determined at the same time. She was watching down the road, in the direction from which the stagecoaches came. Strangers always came from the east, there wasn't much more to the west, between Point Harrow and the end of the world. She watched as though she knew that, any moment now, someone would come around the corner, someone she knew. As though she knew it, or as though she feared it. He caught little else of the details about her appearance: wide gray eyes, dark hair tucked neatly up, delicate features, a brown dress, and a carpetbag on the ground at her feet, before she turned her head and caught his gaze with her own. For a long moment they remained just like that, a silent tableau, strangers to each other. Then the door of the boarding house opened, revealing a rectangle of light. Edna Fuller's voice drifted out. "Miss Shaw?" The stranger turned her gaze away from Daniel's. Her lips scarcely moved as she replied, and he had to strain to hear it. "Mrs.," she said, and stood. He pushed himself into movement almost at the same moment, suddenly in a hurry to get himself inside the post office, to make believe that he hadn't been watching the stranger. Despite his best efforts, the door to the boarding house closed first, and he was left on the street, half in and half out of the post office, watching over his shoulder as shadows moved across the lighted windows of Edna's establishment. His heart was beating as swiftly as though he'd run a mile. He heard George call out his name from inside. "Daniel?" Across the street, someone softly drew the curtains. Chapter 2. The days of early October came and went, lined up neatly like ducklings in a row. The grand old giant oak was planed and parceled out, stacked under the metal-roofed storage shed and waiting for Mr. Rowland to call. More trees came, added to the pile waiting to be milled, money was delivered and money was handed out, and in the midst of it all, Daniel wondered if he would ever truly get rid of the headache that keeping the ledgers caused him. He hadn't told the council about his failure to find a bride. It was easy enough to convince himself that he was far too busy with the business at hand. Besides, what they didn't know wouldn't hurt him. They'd find out eventually, through the rumor mill that worked even more steadily than the sawmill with his name above the door. In the meantime, he had more important things to worry about than Ron Briggs and the rest of the demanding council. Balancing the books, for one thing. His pencil lead broke for the umpteenth time that morning and he bit off a swear of irritation, dropping it on the page and rubbing his hands over his face. A knock on the open door proved to be Pete Danvers, his usual ready grin on his face. "You don't need to censor yourself, you know, Daniel," he said. "I reckon you couldn't come up with any swear words that I haven't heard a dozen times myself, and spoken aloud, too." Daniel narrowed his eyes at him. "Serves me right for trying to care for your delicate sensibilities." "Sure does," Pete said equably, "since I ain't got any." Daniel glanced back down at the books. "You know, I could swear that Clarence knew exactly what he was doing when he decided to retire 2 months ago. It's almost as though he could sense that Roland's job was comin' up and thought it would be fun to see how well I'd handle accounts and the hotel milling at the same time. Not to mention throwin' my hat in the ring for mayor. Daniel, you know Clarence was due to retire, overdue, as a matter of fact. Why, he came to work for your pa when he started the mill, and I reckon he was old even then. He certainly didn't know that you were about to be dragged into the role of mayor." "I guess not," Daniel allowed, rubbing his forehead with one hand. "How is old Clarence, anyhow? Have you seen him lately?" "No, but I ran into Mrs. Fitch at the Mercantile last week." "And what did she have to say?" "Said Clarence was so tickled at the thought of you struggling with these books that he bursts out Logan every 5 minutes, Pete said promptly. He grinned at the groan that Daniel let out and came into the room. "Anyway, we all know you've got too much on your plate, and the last thing we want is to lose track of customer credit. I've put the word out that you need a little help, and someone just showed up at the front door a skin after the position. Many other employers, Daniel knew, would have objected at the thought of their foreman proposing to hire someone without even running the idea past the boss first. But he was so overwhelmed that he felt nothing but gratitude. "Thank you, Pete, what do you reckon?" Pete shrugged. "I don't know a thing about her, but she came with a recommendation from Mrs. Fuller, and Edna's not the sort of woman who easily has the wool pulled over her eyes." Something stirred in Daniel, and his feeling of exhaustion slipped away, replaced by a strange sort of thrill. "All right," he said. "I'm willin' to try anything at this point. Show her in and we'll have a talk." Somehow, he knew who it would be even before she stepped into the room. It wasn't a long shot, strangers were a dime a dozen in Point Harrow these days, but only 1 out of 100 of them was a woman. The girl he had spotted outside of Edna Fuller's boarding house 3 days before had never been far from his thoughts. Again and again, as he had tried to concentrate on the matter at hand, those wide gray eyes and that quiet alertness had returned to hover in front of him like a ghost. And suddenly here she was in the flesh, standing before him with her hands clasped in front of her. In the bright light of the morning, she looked a little older, perhaps nearly 30, and more solid, more real, not exactly the ethereal being he had spotted that night, but no less strikingly pretty for all that. He found his throat going rather dry and harumphed self-consciously as he stood up to shake her hand. "Good morning, Mrs." He trailed off, and saw her cock her head slightly, thoughtful or confused. Of course, he was pretending not to know what her name was, but he hadn't thought to pretend that he hadn't heard her correct Edna Fuller's use of an unmarried honorific. "Miss Shaw, no, Mrs." The mystery of where her husband was, and why she had arrived alone here in Point Harrow, was entirely unsolved. He didn't even have a clue to how to proceed solving it. "Shaw," she said after a moment. "Sharon Shaw. Pleased to make your acquaintance. I'm Daniel Cross. Pete here tells me that you've inquired about the position of bookkeeper. Any prior experience?" He hoped his eagerness to learn about the newcomer wasn't too obvious. He had a feeling that Sharon Shaw would not take kindly to being pressured about her past. "Yes, of course. I was a bookkeeper for a dry goods merchant in Cincinnati, Ohio, for 3 years. He nodded, doing his best to look only mildly interested. "That where you're from?" Sharon Shaw pressed her lips together and turned her head, eyeing him as though she didn't quite trust the reason for the question. After a moment, she said, "Most recently, yes." Which meant no, of course, she came from elsewhere, somewhere much further away, he was willing to bet. New York, maybe, or Pennsylvania. She had an aura of strangeness, of otherness. She had the miles-away look of someone who had gone through a great deal to get where she was, and who knew that there was only more to come. It was alluring, and he found himself having to tear his gaze away again and again. She was like a skittish horse, liable to jerk the other way and run off if he looked at her the wrong way. He thought of the keen alertness with which she had watched the road from the east, as though waiting for someone to appear. Someone had treated this woman badly, and a burst of protective anger at that surged through him. He tried his best to control it, though he wasn't sure how successful the effort was. "All right," he said, striving to keep his voice even and deciding that further questions would be counterproductive at the moment. "Maybe you can cast your eye over these figures and tell me where I've gotten off the trail." He slid the ledger over to her, and she took a seat at the second chair, bending over them for a moment. "I don't have much of an eye for numbers, myself, never was my strong suit. My last bookkeeper, Clarence Fitch, always told me I'd go out of business if I didn't keep him on. I reckon he figured it was job security, but these days I can't help but think he might be right. What do you think, Mrs. Shaw? Can you help me?" He watched her avidly. Her head bowed, she passed a delicate fingertip over the row of numbers, swiftly, then glanced up. "There's a mistake here," she said. "Anne, here." Another glance up, this time expectant. Hiding a smile, he handed her his pencil, and she set to work swiftly, erasing some numbers and amending others. The totals she arrived at were not so very different from the conclusions he'd reached himself, but as he looked over her adjustments he could readily see where he'd gone wrong, and where she'd set him right. When he met her gaze, He knew that his admiration was plain on his face. "Was that a test?" she asked him, one eyebrow raised slightly. "To see whether I truly knew what I was doing?" He shook his head. "Oh, no. I reckon anyone who so much as looks at you knows that you know what you're doing, right off the bat. But I'm glad to see how fast you were at setting things to rights, all the same." He looked up at Pete, who stood just inside the door, grinning. "She's a rare find, Pete. We'd better hand over the credit ledgers to her, too." She pursed her lips pensively. "Do you accept credit, then? In a business this large scale, it would be hard not to. We'd have no more than a handful of customers who were able to pay up front." Sharon Shaw nodded, tapping her lips with her finger. "I can see that, yes. Well, my suggestion would be to go over the books and see how well your customers have kept up with their payments. Those who pay regularly, even if small amounts at a time, might be afforded more generosity. But those who are difficult about it, who drag their feet, ought to be given a deadline, which must be held to strictly, with no room for error." Daniel exchanged glances again with Pete. His foreman looked positively delighted. The issue of customers reluctant to pay what they owed had been a recurring lament. Daniel grinned. "Send out the word," he said. "Mrs. Shaw is on the job, and all our credit customers ought to sit up and take notice." He stood up and held out his hand to Sharon Shaw. She accepted it gravely. "Welcome to Cross Mills, Mrs. Shaw." "Thank you, Mr. Cross." Simply shaking her hand felt as though something significant had passed between them. He bit back the urge to encourage her to call him by his first name, to ask whether he could do the same. It was too much, too soon. They were still strangers to each other. Even though he had every intention of remedying that, as soon as he could. "You're new here, aren't you?" Again, that slightly raised eyebrow. "I rather suspect you know the answer to that. A businessman like you must know every face in the county." "Most of them," he allowed. "But there are a few who escape me. I reckon I'd remember you if I'd met you before. 3 nights ago, seated on the bench outside the boarding house, straight-backed and alert, watching, fairly glowing in the twilight." He pushed the memory away. She evidently did not recall seeing him that evening. "Pete says you're staying at the boarding house?" "Yes. Mrs. Fuller has been very kind. Edna's a good sort." "Did she send you over here?" "Yes, she heard there might be a position from Mr. Danvers. He made a mental note to send Edna Fuller some flowers as a thank you. Would she mind, much, if you don't show up for supper this evening, do you think?" Sharon Shaw regarded him thoughtfully. "Is there so much work to catch up on as all that?" she said. "I don't mind setting in right away, of course, but in truth, the ledgers did not look so dire as you might think. You've done a competent job with them." Surprised by her faint praise. He hid a grin. "Thanks, Mrs. Shaw, but I was actually thinkin' that my mother would get after me with a switch if she heard that I'd taken on a new employee and not invited em to supper. It's traditional, you see, she's always done it, ever since my pa started up the mill before I was even born." Once again, he found himself on the receiving end of that keen, cool stare, as though she was seeing straight through him to the inner workings of his mind. "A switch," she said at last. He nodded. "She's a firecracker, my old ma." Sharon Shaw tilted her head to the side curiously. "All right, then," she said. "But only to save your mother the trouble." Days at the lumber mill tended to go by swiftly, but this one seemed to drag on forever. With the prospect of Sharon Shaw's company at supper, Daniel found himself counting the hours. Pete soon showed Mrs. Shaw to a desk in a spare corner, and she established herself with calm precision, a stack of the ledgers and customer roster at one hand and a pile of freshly sharpened pencils at the other. She was a dedicated and conscientious worker, that much was immediately clear. Each time Daniel went by, he found her head lowered over the ledgers, her pencil busily scribbling. At last, it was 5:30, and time to close up shop for the day. Daniel found Sharon setting her desk to rights neatly. She glanced up at him and, for the first time, favored him with a small smile. Well, are they in as much of a mess as I'd feared? If I say no, you may have second thoughts about hiring me. Never, Daniel thought, though he said nothing. But if I say yes, it may hurt your feelings, since I suspect you're the one who has been caring for the ledgers since the departure of your bookkeeper. You suspect correctly, Daniel told her. So which is it? A small smile played at the edges of her mouth. Yes, she said. They're in a terrible mess. Daniel laughed and held an arm out to her. Shall we? It was a strange feeling to have this pretty stranger on his arm, walking her home. He could almost imagine that they were not strangers at all, but that she was the woman he had married, his new wife, just as the council was demanding. He would bring her home after a long day of work, and they would sit down to supper together, smiling at each other in the flickering light of the candles. He shook himself out of his reverie, startled at how easy it had been to slip into. He wasn't some moonstruck boy who'd never spoken to a woman before. He was a grown man, a businessman, likely to soon be declared mayor of the town he loved so dearly. And she was a woman he knew nothing about, except that she was a Mrs., which meant that somewhere out there was a Mr. Shaw, someone who had some claim on her. The trouble was, she didn't seem like a married woman, though, he admitted to himself, that might easily have been wishful thinking on his part. She seemed to belong entirely to herself, as though no one on earth had any say in her life. Perhaps her husband was gone, perhaps she was divorced, or widowed. Perhaps it was more complicated than he was hoping, but whatever the case, he couldn't bring himself to ask the questions that he so badly wanted to learn the answers to. It was too much, he could sense it. Too much pressure, and she would kick up her heels and run the other way. No, it was enough, for now, to walk beside her with her hand placed delicately on the crook of his elbow, with the October twilight settling in purple majesty on their shoulders. His mother was delighted to have company, as he had figured she would be. Oh, Mrs. Shaw. I'm very pleased to meet you. Edna told me that she had a new lodger, and that you were pretty as a picture. It hadn't even occurred to Daniel that his mother would already know about the new arrival in town, but of course she would, and it was obvious now, looking back. Point Harrow had a thriving source of gossip, and its name was Edna Fuller, who knew everyone and everything. Very kind, Mrs. Cross, Sharon said, smiling. Daniel breathed out a sigh of relief. Evidently, his newest employee did not mind the enthusiasm of his mother. He doubted she would have responded the same way had he been the one to comment on her looks. Oh, Daniel, will you go and ask Hannah to serve supper in 20 minutes? Mrs. Shaw and I will go and sit on the veranda while you clean up. Daniel smothered a grin as he did as his mother had bid. Bernice Cross had a strong personality, and a marked tendency to simply take over any situation she came across. He didn't mind it, that strength had shown him what was possible for a capable woman, even when she became a widow with a young son to raise and a business to run. Now, he suspected that his mother had sensed his interest in Sharon Shaw, and he trusted her to handle the situation delicately. Or, perhaps, to simply cut to the chase, when he returned from washing up, it was to find Bernice quizzing their guest on her past. And did you mind terribly, leaving your parents behind at such a young age? I missed them, of course, but I had made my mind up, and I'm not the sort to shrink back once the decision is set. Bernice nodded in approval. A woman after my own heart. One who sets his hand to the plow and looks back. Is neither worthy of the work, nor the wages, Sharon Shaw said softly. I've never been afraid of hard work, Mrs. Cross. Please, do call me Bernice, my dear. And of course not, you're a strong young lady, I can tell simply by the look in your eye. How did you find life in the territories? I suppose it was very different, after growing up in Philadelphia. Yes, very different. But I liked it all the same. It was a challenge, and I've always enjoyed a challenge. She glanced at Daniel, standing just outside the door, and he tensed, fearful that she would stop talking now that he was in her presence. But after a moment, she went on. My husband was a miner, and he was convinced that he was going to strike gold. I suppose he convinced me, too. We lived every day with the promise of wealth and plenty on the cusp of tomorrow. Her eyes went far away again, and she seemed to shrink into herself a little. But that tomorrow never came. Into the silence, Bernice's voice was soft and gentle. How did he die? Sharon Shaw pressed her lips together. She did not look in Daniel's direction again. He was on the claim, some 15 miles from our little house in town. His friend told me there was a rock slide. They left him there. A soft gasp from Bernice, but Sharon looked up with something like defiance. I told them to, she said. With no hope of survival, there seemed little point in retrieving him. He was buried there as sure as he would have been buried in any churchyard, and I doubt that holy ground would have had him. He was not a nice man. Her eyes fell again, as though ashamed. Of course, I shouldn't speak ill of the dead. No, said Bernice stoutly, putting a hand on her arm, but you can darn well speak the truth. From the sounds of things, you are far better off as a widow than you ever were as a wife. Sharon Shaw gave a sad half-smile, as though acknowledging the truth of this. Well, she said, I'm here now. 4 years older, and, I hope, a little wiser, too. It was remarkable, Daniel thought, how his mother operated. He'd spent the entire day just around the corner from Mrs. Shaw and knew nothing about her other than her name and her facility with sums. His mother had spent 20 minutes with her and knew everything from where she had been born, to her family situation, to what had happened to her husband. What she didn't know, of course, was why Sharon Shaw had not returned to her parents after the death of her husband, and how she had come to be here in Point Harrow. But he reckoned that Bernice would winkle those details out over supper. His mother, after all, was a marvel. Chapter 3. Supper came and went without any more answers to Daniel's questions, but he knew, at least, that Sharon Shaw was a widow, and he told himself that he would have to be content with that, for now. It did no good to pretend, even to himself, that he was not intrigued by her, no, not just intrigued, but drawn to her, helpless in the grip of her gaze. It seemed ridiculous, for a man his age to suddenly fall head over heels with a complete stranger, but ridiculousness was no argument against reality, and he couldn't deny the telltale flutter of his heart each time he laid eyes on her. At least he had the good sense to realize that he couldn't rush into anything, or pressure her to any feelings for him in return. What little he'd learned about her past told him that her experience with men and marriage had been less than pleasant, though she had refused to give details about her former husband. The little she had said made him feel flushed with protective anger. No woman deserved to be treated badly, he couldn't imagine mistreating anyone himself, and the thought of her delicate strength pushed to the limit by some scoundrel who trapped her into marriage made him seethe if he let himself think about it. So he tried not to let himself think about it. The next few days went by with startling smoothness. Sharon Shaw settled into her duties with scarcely a ripple. The ledges were corrected inside of a day, and each evening she brought them to him to see where the day's business had ended up. Recalcitrant customers were hunted down and brought into the office to pay what they owed, shame on their faces before Sharon Shaw's calm, stern gaze. The business, which had been staggering a little over the last several months, seemed to right itself like a ship in suddenly calm seas. Pete was overjoyed not to have to spend so much time in the office trying to put out financial fires, and Daniel, for his part, realized reluctantly that he now had one less excuse to avoid the ever-present loom of mayoral responsibilities. Ronald Briggs came to see him the next week. I just thought I ought to remind you of your duty, he said, arms folded, since it seems there's been a hitch in your giddy-up. Daniel leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. Speak plain, Ron, I haven't got any time to spare. It wasn't entirely true, of course, now that Sharon was helping him with the accounts, but Briggs didn't need to know that. He glanced toward the doorway, thinking of Sharon sitting just around the corner at her desk, likely poring over the ledgers and finding new ways to make things just a bit better. Could she hear this conversation? He ought to have thought to close the door. Well, Daniel, seems that your contract with that matrimonial agency hasn't exactly panned out. Daniel gritted his teeth. The poor girl died, 1,000 miles away from her home and family, he said. I reckon that's more important than the failure of any contract. Oh, don't think me unfeeling, Briggs said, waving a hand. I would have sent a letter of condolence to Miss Marsh's family myself, except I know that you did already. That tragedy is beside the point, I'm afraid, Daniel. The point being that you have only 30 days left in which to find a wife and marry, if you want the council to back you as our new mayor." Daniel stared at him, his thoughts reeling. For the first time, he wondered whether he really wanted the council to back him. Did he want to be the mayor? Was it worth all this trouble? It would take him away from the mill, which seemed to be shaping up quite well despite the fact that they were heading into winter. It would take him away from the new bookkeeper, who was even now likely listening in just around the corner. If only he could just marry Sharon Shaw, what trouble would be saved? Almost as though Briggs had read his mind, the councilman said, "Now, far be it from me to stick my oar in where it isn't wanted, but what about that young woman you have working for you now, on accounts?" He grinned mischievously. "She's pretty enough, isn't she? And smart as paint, evidently. What's her name, now, Miss Shaw, is it?" It made no sense, but to hear his own thoughts spoken aloud by Councilman Ronald Briggs filled Daniel with resentment. "Mrs.," he said shortly. Briggs made a face. "Oh," he said. "I see. Well, that's a shame, Daniel, a real shame. I would have thought, still, no use crying over spilt milk, and if there's a husband, oh, well. I hope you won't let her distract you, Daniel, from the real issue at hand." He tapped his fingers on the desk meaningfully. 30 days, Daniel Cross, 30 days, and not an hour more. Mercifully, now that his message was delivered, he saw fit to leave soon thereafter. Daniel accompanied him back out through the front door, more to ensure that he left than to be polite. For a long moment, he stood and watched the councilman's broad back as the older man went on his way. He took in the sweetness of the October sunshine, with its hint of gold, and the busyness of the lumber yard, the far-off screech of the mill saws hard at work. He turned at last, with a sigh, and found that Sharon was watching him from her desk. To his surprise, she made no attempt to pretend otherwise, only tilted her head curiously at him. "You really love it here, don't you?" she said. "The mill, I mean." "I do. It's the biggest part of me. My earliest memories are right here, with my pa, watching the logs get turned into something beautiful and strong." She nodded slowly. "I'm surprised, then," she said, "that you would consider anything else. Since you love it so much." He stepped toward her, arms folded. "I'll never give it up, not entirely. But I feel that I owe something to Point Harrow. There's so much to be done here, and without a steady hand on the tiller, things could go badly wrong for the folks who live here, the folks who love it as much as I do." He sighed. "Oregon's bursting with fortune hunters. Mining, milling, hunting, why, thousands of strangers pass through Point Harrow every year. I'd hate to see anyone get hurt by unscrupulous scoundrels. Isn't that what the sheriff is for?" She raised her eyebrows. He shrugged. "Sure, and calmly knows his business. He and I were in school together. We've been old enemies for so long that we became friends." He smiled, and was glad to see that she smiled, too, seeming to understand his words. James Conley had been Daniel's chief competition for everything when they were boys. If his father hadn't owned the mill, Daniel reckoned he would have gone up against Conley for the role of county sheriff, too. But now they were older, and at least somewhat wiser, and their long-standing competition had eased into a teasing, brother-like friendship. But the role of mayor isn't about enforcing the law, it's about protecting the heart of Point Harrow, the spirit of it. It's about moving into the future without losing the past. Does that bother you so much, then, the idea of losing the past? There was an undertone of bitterness in her voice that made him look at her sharply, but he knew without asking that she would not express what she was thinking. "Not as much as I'm frightened of the future," he said. "At least, some aspects of it, anyhow. The council has insisted that I marry before I become mayor." He shrugged, feeling suddenly very small and foolish. Something about being traditional, steady, stable. "I suppose I can see why they would want such qualities in the man who will lead the town into the future. I guess I can, too. Still, doesn't seem right, does it? Pressure a man into marrying a complete stranger, how's that going to ensure steadiness?" She pressed her lips together and dropped her gaze. "I'm afraid you don't want my opinion on the matter," she said. His breath caught a little in his chest, and he leaned forward, reaching a hand for hers. He stopped himself just in time, before he touched her. "I do," he said. "I do want." She looked up and met his gaze, and the rest of his words fell away into silence. There was tragedy in those beautiful gray eyes, sorrow and suffering and pain and loss. Had she felt pressured into marriage, herself? Was that why she hadn't returned home after the death of her husband, because it was her own parents who put her in that position to begin with? Once again, he felt the flare of anger, protective and sharp. It was becoming a familiar sensation. "Daniel? Mr. Rowland is here to look over the progress. Got a minute?" Daniel wasn't sure whether he wanted to bless Pete Danvers or curse him. His foreman stood in the doorway, smiling, completely oblivious to the tension of the moment he had interrupted. And why shouldn't he be, Daniel thought wryly. It wasn't as though anything had been about to happen. It wasn't as though he could simply throw caution to the winds and sweep Sharon Shaw into his arms, begging her to marry him and be the mayor's wife. He knew a little about her, but that little was just enough to tell him that there was so much more that remained secret. And with patience and time, and a lot of care, he might yet pick apart the knot that tied her to the past she so desperately wanted to be rid of. Chapter 4. There were 18 days left to his mayoral marriage deadline when the stranger came knocking at Daniel's door. "Daniel?" He looked up from the papers sprawled across his desk. In a fit of appreciation and generosity, he told Sharon that she ought to take the day off. She had politely declined but agreed to go and see a few of his customers who had yet to be shamed into catching up with their accounts past due. It was Pete who stood in his doorway. "Visitor for you." Daniel gave vent to a faint groan. "Can't you deal with him, Pete? I've got paperwork and proposals coming out my ears." Pete grinned. "Imagine how deep you'll be buried once you're actually the mayor." "No, don't imagine it, we don't want to scare you off. But I think you'll want to see this fellow yourself, boss." "Why, what's he got to offer?" Pete blinked innocently. "Paperwork and proposals, I reckon." Daniel narrowed his eyes at his friend but waved him on. Pete disappeared around the corner for a moment, and reappeared with another man in front of him, ushering him in. The stranger appeared to need no encouragement, advancing on Daniel with quick strides and an outstretched hand. "Mr. Cross? Pleased to make your acquaintance. I'm Hollis Carter, and I represent one of the biggest opportunities Point Harrow has ever seen." Daniel eyed the man suspiciously, even as he shook his offered hand. "You start every conversation this way?" Hollis Carter laughed. He had a wide mouth, perhaps that was why his laugh seemed so much larger than that of most people. It almost filled the room. Despite his apparent easygoingness, there was something about Carter that put Daniel on edge. He couldn't put his finger on why. To all appearances, Hollis Carter was a perfectly normal sort of fellow, likely in his early 40s, beginning to bald, but trim and athletic still. He was dressed in a three-piece suit without a speck of dust, contrary to what Daniel would have expected from someone who had just arrived in town. "I reckon my enthusiasm runs away with me at times," he said, accepting the chair that Daniel waved him toward. "But you'll understand it when I tell you why." "All right, then, go ahead. Straight to the point. I like that in a colleague, and in a friend. You're a businessman, Mr. Cross, and so am I. I am here in Point Harrow as a representative of Parson and Beam Enterprises." Daniel frowned at him. The name rang a faint bell, but he couldn't quite remember where he'd heard it. "Parson and Beam," Carter prompted him. "Only the fastest-growing chain of mercantile and department stores in the whole of the West. Founded only 6 years ago, but they already have 5 stores throughout Nevada and California." Daniel said. "Well, Mr. Cross, I'm here to offer you a brand new opportunity, an exciting opportunity, to make Point Harrow the first town in Oregon to play host to Parson and Beam." He stopped and, well, Daniel couldn't think of another word for it, beamed at him for a moment, as though the heavens were about to open up and allow a choir of angels to sing. Daniel leaned back and folded his arms. "I appreciate the gesture, Mr. Carter, but I'm not sure that I'm the man you want to see. I own the sawmill, you see, and that's about it. I'm not looking to go into business as a merchant. Perhaps not, Mr. Cross, but don't be too hasty to turn down this chance. My employers at Parson and Beam are perfectly competent to run the business themselves, but they're also deeply invested in building up the towns they make a home in. They won't come in without a partner, and who better to be a partner than the new mayor? Daniel shook his head. I'm no mayor, not yet. And yet, when I asked around in town, folks were unanimous that you were the man to speak to. Change is in the wind, Mr. Cross, and there's no better time to get in on a deal than on the ground floor, Carter chuckled. A little construction humor for you, Mr. Cross, I'm sure a man like you will appreciate. We like to do things as by the book as we can, civic-minded, that's us. If we can't move into a town with the backing and support of the locals, why, we know enough to see that we're not wanted. From what I've seen of your town, Mr. Cross, I can tell that Point Harrow is ripe for the future, ripe for progress. And Parson and Beam are just the folks to help move all of you along to where you want to be. He took a stack of papers from his leather bag and dropped them with a resounding slap on Daniel's desk. Just think it over, will you? I'll be in town for a while, and I'm sure you and I will talk again soon. He gave Daniel a wink. I won't take up any more of your valuable time, Mr. Cross, I'll just show myself out. Then he was gone, whistling cheerfully. Daniel watched after him for a moment, then shook his head. Not sure how I feel about that one, he said aloud. He heard the door close and got to his feet, heading for the hallway. Listen, Pete, I don't know. But it wasn't Pete in the entryway, it was Sharon Shaw. There was a look on her face that made him soften, stepping forward swiftly. Sharon. Her eyes found his, looking dark and wounded. She turned away from him and went to her desk. On the surface, all seemed as usual, calm and collected, but he couldn't help but notice that her hand trembled as she lifted her pencil. He went to the desk and got to his knees beside her. What is it? She shook her head. That man who was in here, do you know him? He laughed hollowly. Not hardly. He came barging in here half an hour ago, but I'd never seen him before that. Why, do you know him? She wouldn't meet his gaze. He saw her lips pressed together as she shook her head. Did he say something to you? Something he oughtn't? She said nothing, and his heart grew hot. I'll go after him now and drag him back, the scoundrel. He was on his feet, ready to launch through the door when he realized that her hand had covered his. No, please, Daniel, don't do that. It isn't that he said anything. It's just that, her gaze fell once more, that desperate look in her eyes veiled again. I don't like him, she said. That's all. She would say nothing more after that, only bent her head to her work. But the poison of worry had entered Daniel's heart. There was something about the stranger that had put him off, and even more so now that Sharon Shaw so clearly had something against him. If it wasn't something the man had said or done, then it must be on account of something from her past, her unknown, secret past. It wasn't until much later that he realized suddenly that her first name had slipped from his lips, without him even being aware of it, and that she, in turn, had called him Daniel. The unknown bond between them had grown a little tighter. He was still puzzling over the strange occurrences of the afternoon when Pete came to collect him that evening. Friday night, he said, grinning from the doorway. Tom will be wondering where we're at. Tom ought to know that I'm busy, Daniel said, without looking up. Too busy for the saloon. Never. Come on, Daniel, everyone will want to see the mayor-elect in person. I reckon they'll even stand you a drink. Maybe they'll stand me one, too. 18 days, Daniel thought. And if I don't marry by then, Pete won't be able to count on free drink simply by his association with the new mayor. But he couldn't turn his friend down. After all, they had been working hard all week, and Sharon had long since left to return to the boarding house. He stood up and stretched. All right, he said. Just one. But even Pete's cheerful prattle couldn't stop Daniel from parsing through the question of Hollis Carter and his proposition. The more he thought it through, the more he realized it didn't make sense. If Parson and Beam were such a noteworthy business, then they had no need of courting the support of a local mill owner. Why did he go through all the trouble of seeking out Daniel's help? There was something more to the story, something he didn't know. Something that James Conley evidently did. The tall, spare figure of the sheriff appeared through the dimness of the saloon, shaking off the autumn chill. Pete waved him over and pushed out a chair with his boot. "Join us, Sheriff. I was just about to toast Daniel's new business venture." Conley raised an eyebrow at Daniel, who shook his head. "Pete's talkin' faster than he thinks," he said. "You know I've got too much on my plate to take on another business." "I should hope so, considering that what's on your plate involves the future and leadership of Point Harrow." The sheriff nodded his thanks as Tom set a beer down in front of him. "I'd hate to see you get distracted, Cross. You handle your business, Conley, and I'll handle mine." They raised their glasses to each other, both smiling wryly, and drank. "What's this about a new business, anyhow?" Conley asked. Daniel let Pete tell the tale of the arrival of Carter and his proposal. He watched as Conley's handsome face grew rather strained and serious. "And you're considering accepting this?" he asked at last, dark eyes meeting Daniel's across the table. "Thinkin' about it, that's all. It's not a bad idea. I wouldn't want to run the place myself, but I'd lend a hand at building it, if it would be good for Point Harrow." He took a drink from his glass. "For all that, I can't help but feel that there's something fishy about this Hollis Carter. He's a little too determined for my taste." Conley leaned forward, frowning. "What's fishy isn't Carter, it's Parson and Beam itself," he said. "I reckon what Carter said is right, they're one of the fastest growing enterprises in the whole of the West. But it isn't just the mercantiles. Once they get a foothold in a town, they bring in all sorts of things and undercut the prices of the folks who have spent their whole lives there working hard to keep food on the table. I've heard of plenty of men who have lost their livelihoods after Parson and Beam moved in. That's why they want the support of the incoming mayor. I bet no one would say anything against you, even if they don't like what Parson and Beam are doing." Daniel rubbed his chin. "That's so," he said softly. His mind was running a mile a minute, putting pieces together. Yes, what Conley said made sense. It answered his own sense of unease about Hollis Carter, for one thing, and Carter's curious insistence on his support. "Maybe that's been the case elsewhere," Pete said, eyeing him, "but that doesn't mean it'll have to be the case here. Carter seems to know what he's doing." "Carter's just the salesman," Conley objected. "If what you're sayin' is true, as soon as the go-ahead is given, he'll be off to the next town to do his job all over again. Just try stallin' him for a bit, Daniel, and see what story he gives you next. Pretty soon he'll be tryin' to make you believe that Parson and Beam are practically a charity organization, with their only goal to make folks smile." "There's nothin' wrong with a little competition," pointed out Pete. Conley snorted. "I'd like to hear you say that when Parson and Beam Enterprises opens up a sawmill and sells pine boards at $2 per 1,000 feet. Pete blanched. Nobody could sell it that cheap. They'd find a way, at least until they ran you out of business. "I know they're kind, Pete Danvers, and they're the last thing Point Harrow needs." "Point Harrow is changing," Daniel said, "whether we like it or not." "Maybe so," said Conley, his eyes meeting Daniel's steadily, "but we ought to see it change for the better." "That's why you want to be the mayor, isn't it?" Daniel sighed and looked away. "What I want isn't what's important," he said. "The council won't back me unless I meet their stipulations, and right now, it's lookin' a whole hell of a lot like I won't. I'm beginnin' to think that Hollis Carter came to the wrong person, if he wants the support of the town. He's barking up the wrong tree." Sheriff Conley shook his head. "That's a lot of nonsense," he said. "You and I never saw eye to eye growin' up, Daniel Cross, but even I know that you're the best man for the job. Point Harrow couldn't have a mayor who cared more about it, about its people. And if I know that, then the council knows it too." He lifted his glass to Daniel. Daniel, smiling despite his exhaustion, lifted his back. Pete glanced from one to the other and grinned. "I know a hint when I see one," he said. "Tom." Another round. Chapter 5. Now that Hollis Carter had made his presence known in Point Harrow, it seemed like he was lurking around every corner. Over the next day and a half, Daniel spotted him coming out of the saloon, chatting with a local on the street corner, and waving cheerfully at everyone as he rode by on a peevish-looking bay, all in such quick succession that Daniel started to wonder whether the man had two identical brothers. The most egregious of his appearances, the one that made Daniel want to grind his teeth, was when he popped into the mercantile and made conversation with Mr. Jones, the owner. All innocent as to Carter's real purpose, Mr. Jones readily shared information regarding his trade. And, of course, I couldn't be in business without my loyal customers, like Daniel here, he was saying as Daniel entered, the bell above the door tinkling wildly. His pa bought up the land that became the mill a few years before Daniel was born, and the crosses have been steady as rocks. It's no wonder that everyone wants Daniel to be our new mayor. He chuckled. That's the main thing about Point Harrow folks, Mr. Carter. We may not be the fanciest or the prettiest, but by gum we're the most loyal to our own in all the West. Of course, that's not to say that we don't welcome newcomers, all the same, he added, giving Carter a friendly nod. That's the sort of man I figured you were, soon as I laid eyes on you, Carter told him, beaming. Loyal, sure, but also generous to a fault. You wouldn't turn a blind eye to a stranger in need, especially one who wanted to make Point Harrow his own home. Why, any man who wants to call Point Harrow home is as near a neighbor to me as Charles Dean, and Charlie lives just next door. The two chuckled, and Daniel moved deeper into the store, shaking his head. Hollis Carter had a certain charm to him, that much was clear, but he would bet 100 to 1 that it was entirely false. And that wasn't just because Sharon's reaction had biased him either. Hollis Carter was as empty as a vacant lot, and just as soulless. It wasn't until that evening, when he ran into Ronald Briggs, that he realized just how much damage Carter was capable of doing. Aha, Daniel. I was thinking I ought to come and see you. Fancy runnin' into you here in the street. Briggs grinned at him, and Daniel managed to smile back. It's a small town, he said. And I live right around the block. I guess it isn't such a coincidence as all that. Now, Daniel, don't tell me that you're going to split hairs. I wouldn't think a man in your position would make free that way. My position? Daniel folded his arms, leaning back against the wall behind him. The bricks were still warm from the sun. The mill hadn't provided the building materials for the jailhouse, as it had been standing long before Harold Cross had opened his sawmill. What do you mean by that, Councilman? Briggs eyed him. 16 days, by my count, he said. That's all that's left. I expect to hear of your nuptials any day, now, my boy. Tell me, has the matrimonial agency sent you a new bride? Daniel gritted his teeth. No, they haven't. And I don't reckon they will, since I told em not to bother. Ronald Briggs' eyes widened in something like shock, though Daniel didn't believe that it was genuine. Not to bother. Daniel Cross, do you have some girl tucked away that we don't know about? In a town like this, I wouldn't be able to keep it secret if I did. No, I suppose not. Well, what is it, then? Don't you want to be the mayor? Daniel sighed. Sometimes I'm not too sure whether I do or not, he said. I reckon I could do a lot of good for the town. I'm a good businessman, got a decent head on my shoulders. And you know nobody loves it like I do, that's the most important thing, isn't it? Sure, son. More important than whether I'm married or not. Oh, now, come on, Daniel. It isn't as though the council and I have made up these rules arbitrarily. Daniel raised an eyebrow. No. It's a matter of stability, Daniel. He waved a hand at him. I know. I've heard your reasons before. Just so happens I don't agree with them. For a few moments the two men stood in silence, each with their own thoughts that, Daniel was willing to bet, were entirely contrary in nature. This is not the time to shrink back from the responsibility of mayoral office, Briggs went on at last, his tone a bit gentler. The town needs someone to step up and take the reins. Why don't you do it, then, Ron? You're a married man. Children, grandchildren. Oh, Daniel. He chuckled dustily. You know as well as I do that whoever takes on the office of mayor is liable to have it for the next 40, 50 years. Well, I don't have 40 or 50 years left in me, my boy. I'm 66, and far too old a dog to start learning new tricks. Besides, my wife would never agree to it. She thinks I'm too much in the public eye as it is, and you know she can't stand to be the center of attention. That's true, Daniel agreed with a sigh. Dolly Briggs was as shy and retiring a woman as he'd ever met. In all his life, he didn't think he'd heard more than 10 words from her. Though that might well have been because her husband never stopped talking. Besides, as you said, you're a businessman, and that will only be to the good for Point Harrow. Why, just this morning a fellow came to see me about a new mercantile he wants to open here in town. It sounds like a wonderful opportunity. Daniel glanced up at Briggs sharply. Was his name Hollis Carter? Matter of fact, it was. He told me he'd come to see you. Yes, he had. Well? Briggs watched him expectantly. Daniel pressed his lips together. I don't think it's a good idea, he said. I don't think an enterprise like Parson and Beam would be good for the town. Briggs was already waving a hand at him, dismissing his words as though meaningless. It isn't about how you feel about things, you know, Daniel, it's about business. Growth. The future. I don't think you understand the truth of it, Councilman. Maybe it's you who don't understand, Mr. Cross, Briggs said sharply, frowning at him. From the sounds of things, this is an opportunity the likes of which Point Harrow has never seen. I'm surprised at you. A businessman ought to know better than to turn things down out of hand. I'm not turning anything down out of hand, Daniel objected. Despite his general irritation with Briggs, the word stung. I was talking with James Conley and... What does the sheriff know about business? Briggs shook his head. But you're right, Daniel, you're not turning anything down, you have no say in the matter. After all, you're not the mayor. Not yet. And unless you get married in the next few weeks, you never will be. It's a long-standing tradition. His glare softened a little. Come on, Daniel, it isn't so much to ask, really, that you take a wife, like every other mayor of Point Harrow before you? There's only ever been 2. That's beside the point, Daniel. I don't see how you can call 2 a long-standing tradition. Isn't there anyone you wouldn't mind marrying? Daniel opened his mouth, the name coming readily to his tongue. Sharon Shaw. But he stopped himself just in time and closed his mouth again without saying anything. It wasn't fair, not to her, and not to him. Not even to Ronald Briggs, come to that. It wasn't fair to anyone. He'd been intrigued by her from the beginning, and unsure of her marital situation. Well, his mother's questioning had put paid to that, letting him know that she was a widow. But just because her husband was dead and gone certainly did not mean that everything was straightforward and simple. Far from it. He'd only known Sharon Shaw for a week, but she was easily the most complicated woman he'd ever met. And the most attractive. The last thing he wanted to do was frighten her away. And he knew in his heart that pushing her too far, too fast, would do just that. Especially since she knew that the council had demanded he marry in order to be the mayor. If he asked to court her, what would she see that as but a transparent attempt to win the role by taking advantage of his new employee? No, he couldn't do something like that to her. Or to himself. It isn't that simple, he said at last. Briggs scoffed. That's what you think, he said. Why, I asked my wife to marry me the week after we met, and I've never had a single regret. I believe you, said Daniel. I suppose your wife feels the same? Of course she does. Have you asked her? Offended, Ronald Briggs did what he usually did, he began to bluster. I don't have to ask her. I know precisely what she's thinking at all times. He threw his hands in the air and spun on his heels so quickly that he nearly went over sideways, storming away from Daniel. Honestly, Daniel, I don't know why I bother to, at all times, d'you hear me? At the end of the block, he paused just long enough to shout over his shoulder once more. At all times. Daniel permitted himself a smile, even though what he really wanted was to laugh out loud. It was childish of him to poke at the pompous councilman. Briggs really did seem to want to support him, for the most part. But sometimes the confusion of his situation just overwhelmed him, and he couldn't help but unleash his exhaustion in some fashion. Daniel shook his head and sighed. "Well," he said, "nobody's perfect, I guess. With the possible exception," he thought, "of Sharon Shaw." Chapter 6. 2 more days went by, and everything seemed to glide to a calm, quiet halt. Well, Daniel had to admit, not everything. The mill was as busy as ever, surprisingly so, for October was nearly over and they were on the heels of autumn with winter just ahead. The bustling, busy town of Point Harrow usually slowed down in the snowy season. Perhaps that was the reason for the hurry, Daniel thought, for the owners of the businesses that were growing around him were anxious to get as much done before the first snowfall as they could manage. But it promised to be an early winter, and the rains had already started. The logs that waited to be processed grew sodden dark, too heavy to move. Under Pete's direction, canvas tarpaulins were drawn over the piles to protect them as much as possible. And still the sawmill, under its tall steel roof, churned on. But as far as the push to take on mayoral responsibilities, he heard not a word about it from Briggs or any of the other councilmen. Clearly, he had irked Briggs more than he'd thought with his comments. A latent sense of guilt ran through him, and he left his piled high desk to go and apologize to the man. "He's not in at the moment, Mr. Cross," his secretary told him. Daniel eyed him. "You're sure?" he said. "He's not just hiding from me because I was unkind to him?" "No, Mr. Cross." The secretary sounded shocked at the very idea. "Mr. Briggs would never do that. He's a very honest man." Daniel smiled wryly. "He is, at that," he agreed. "Well, tell him that I came by to apologize for what I said, would you? And I know it isn't enough to pass it on by messenger, so I'll be back. Still, I don't want him to try and hide from me next time I'm around, not that he would," he added hastily, for the secretary's benefit. "Still, just tell him, would you?" He was still smiling and shaking his head over the matter as he returned to his own office at the lumber yard. The sound of voices greeted him as he stepped up on the veranda, and something about the tone made him push forward all the more swiftly. "And what do you think he'll say, when I tell him the truth? The truth about you, the oh-so-virtuous Mrs. Shaw." He opened the door so suddenly and violently that it flew back and bounced off the wall. The two people in the entryway, next to Sharon's desk, froze in a startled tableau. Sharon, back to her desk, wide-eyed and flushed, and Hollis Carter, leaning over her menacingly. At the sight of her employer, Carter shrank back at once, turning away from Sharon and clearing his throat. "Ah, there you are, Mr. Cross. I was just, passing the time with your charming assistant." Daniel looked from his unctuous smile to Sharon's downcast face. 2 bright spots of red burned in her pale cheeks. If it wasn't embarrassment, it was anger. He knew which of the two he'd put his money on. He'd been raised by one of the most strong-willed women in the whole of Oregon. He knew anger when he saw it. "Out." The word came out like a thrown stone. It hit with such force that Carter actually rocked back a step. He lifted a hand. "Now, see here, Mr. Cross. Out." Daniel stood aside, just enough to allow Carter to pass him, but not enough to make it comfortable for the other man. Carter narrowed his eyes at him as he went but turned on the top step of the veranda and plastered on another smile. "I hope this misunderstanding won't get in the way of our business arrangements. Carter, if you don't get off my property this minute, I'll throw you in the river, tied around a 12-foot plank." Carter put his hands in the air as though Daniel had him at gunpoint. "Another time, then," he said blithely, and slithered off down the steps. Daniel stood for a moment, watching him, then spun back into the room and slammed the door. "What on earth?" Sharon looked up at him. Her eyes were like silver, her cheeks still burning. He was right, she was angry. But there was something else there too, something that reminded him of the first few times he'd seen her. That alertness, that underlying fear. It had come back. And it was because of Hollis Carter. He stepped forward, his voice gentle now. Do you know him? She bit her lip and nodded, her eyes still on his. She seemed unable to speak, but her eyes were eloquent, if only he could understand. He reached out a hand. Sharon, he said softly. Tell me. I'll help you, whatever it is, I won't let him harm you. A choked sob was all she could manage, and suddenly she was across the room, in his arms, burying her face in his chest. He held her tightly, arms wrapped around her as though he would never let go, and she wept onto his shirt front until she was spent. At last, she looked up, her eyes still wet and her throat pulsing. I'm sorry, she managed at last. I didn't mean to. Daniel shook his head. It's all right, he told her quietly. Everything's going to be all right, don't you worry. He was sharply aware of how skittish she was, of how easy it would be to scare her off in the midst of her emotions. He only meant to kiss her softly on the forehead, a brotherly sort of touch, to reassure her. But something happened on the journey there, and his lips were on hers, suddenly, but still gently. And for a moment, impossibly, she seemed to return the embrace, leaning up against him. As suddenly as it had started, it was over, and she stepped back hastily, her arms wrapped around herself. Daniel fairly fell over himself trying to apologize. I didn't mean, I wasn't intending to, I'm sorry, Sharon, really I am, he ran a hand through his hair, staring at her with wild eyes. She wouldn't meet his gaze. It was a mistake, that's all, she said, and he knew she was excusing him. His heart turned over. Not a mistake, he said, roughly now. I didn't mean to, not right this minute, but God knows I wanted to, and intended to, later, when you'd had enough time. As much time as you need, Sharon, I promise you. I don't know what you've run from, but I know you're frightened and you're hurt, and I would never do anything to harm you. I promise you that, Sharon, but I can't pretend that I'm not falling in love with you. 'Cause I am. He stopped suddenly, biting his lip, wishing that she would respond. When she did not, he held out a hand to her again and went on, more softly now. I'm quite sure I already love you, Sharon Shaw, and I would like to court you. I know we don't know each other, and there's no reason for you to trust me beyond my word. But if you're willing to give me a chance, something tells me that we'd be good for each other. That you might, in time, learn to love me. That you might even decide to marry me. Now, at last, her eyes met his. They were full of sorrow, and a curious sort of coldness that he felt all the way to his toes. I'm sorry, Daniel, she said. I can't love you. I can't ever marry you. Sharon. That's all, she said quietly. She held up a hand as though to ward him off, and he stepped aside, letting her pass him and go out the door. In the empty office, listening to the echoes of his own protestations of love, he felt a stillness in his heart that he had never felt before. For the first time, it felt as though something was absent. He knew then that life had tricked him. It was 2 weeks until his deadline to marry in order to become the mayor of the town he loved, and the girl he wanted with all his heart had turned him down. The timing was too perfect. Someone, he suspected, was having a good laugh at his expense. Chapter 7. Bernice Cross looked up sharply as her son came in. For a long moment, she eyed him closely, seeming to judge his attitude, and then she began to untie her apron with quick, decisive movements. Daniel slumped onto his usual position on the hearth and eyed her right back. Where are you going, Ma? To Edna Fuller's boarding house. But it's almost supper time. Precisely. Ma, can't your gossip wait? I'm sure Edna will be busy feeding all her lodgers. I'm not going to see Edna, Daniel. I'm going to see that young Miss Shaw. Mrs., Daniel murmured, chin on hand. Whoever she is, I'm going to give her a piece of my mind. Imagine treating you like this, after you gave her a job. Simply not showing up for work for 2 days, now. She clucked like an irritated hen. Well, you've got a business to run, and it does not happen at her whim. If you won't tell her, then I will. Ma, wait, Ma. He went after her as she started down the hallway and brought her back, pulling out one of the kitchen chairs and seating her in it firmly. With a sigh, he sat down across from her and leaned his elbows on the table. How'd you know she didn't come in today? Look at the state of you, Bernice cried, waving a hand at him. All a mother would have to do is look into your eyes, or see the droop of your mouth. Why, I reckon just about anyone would be able to tell that something was wrong. It isn't right that she should cause you this worry, when you've been so busy with work. He shook his head. I don't think you understand it quite right, Ma. Bernice huffed and folded her arms. Well, then you just explain it to me, Daniel. With a twist in his heart, Daniel did his best. I'm not upset because she didn't come to work, he said. I'm upset because she's been avoiding me entirely, and I know why. It's because I made her uncomfortable, I guess. Pushed her too far, too fast. It's all my fault, Ma. And I thought we had a future together, honest I did. He put his head in his hands, keenly aware that his mother was watching him closely. A moment's pause went by, but he knew that it was just a matter of Bernice gathering her thoughts. All too soon, she did just that. Daniel Cross, are you telling me that you're in love with this girl? Miserably, he nodded, still not looking up. He heard her intake of breath. And the little fool turned you down? Why, I'll tell her what's what, just you wait. Ma. This time, she moved more swiftly, and she made it to the veranda before he managed to chase her down. He pulled her into the rocker bench alongside him and held onto her arm to keep her from escaping again. There's more to it than that, Ma. Well, what? His mother demanded, and Daniel shook his head. I don't rightly know. But listen, Ma, I know she isn't just dismissing me out of hand. She's not the sort of woman who does things simply on a whim, and I believe she knows I'd be true. We get along all right, her and me, it's just, well, something else must have happened in her past that keeps her from even thinking of marrying again. He leaned back in the rocker, eyes on the yard. The grasses had turned green again with the rains and a blustery little breeze chased brilliant yellow leaves from the oaks. You've seen for yourself how she's cautious, alert. Something in her past scared her, and it's haunting her still. His mother's ire had passed, she was a gentle soul at heart, though quick to defend her family and home, and the thought of Sharon's unknown plight obviously touched her. It'll be something to do with that no-good rotten husband of hers, I expect, she allowed, sinking back against the cushions beside him. You could tell just from the way she spoke about him that it wasn't a good match. I suspect her parents made it for her. I wondered about that, too. That would explain why she didn't go home after he died. Yes, there's some bitterness there, or I'll miss my guess. Poor thing. She said they were married for 8 years, and he's been gone for 2. She was hardly more than a girl when they were wed. She heaved a sigh, and Daniel knew that Sharon Shaw was no longer in any danger from his irate mother. Are you sure you can't simply go and ask her what's the matter, Daniel? I'm sure, he said. I wouldn't force a frightened dog to let me kennel him, far less press a frightened woman to tell me her secrets, even if all I want to do is help her. His mother gave him a fond smile and put a hand on his. That's because I raised you right, Daniel Cross, she said. You're a good man, and the town needs a man like you to be the mayor. Daniel groaned and closed his eyes. To be honest, he said, I've almost forgotten about it, these past few days. But the question of who would be Point Harrow's next mayor had not, evidently, forgotten about him. Until the decision was made, there was always the chance that he would be influential in the leadership of the town, going forward, even though, with only 12 days left before the deadline, it was looking less and less likely with every passing moment. Ronald Briggs had come to speak to him, and apologies had been duly made. The tenuous friendship between himself and the members of the council was always only a few steps away from disruption, so Daniel didn't worry about it too much. If they wanted to back him, they would. If they didn't, well, he wasn't entirely certain that he wanted the job anyway. Though it was difficult, on a fresh November morning, when the sunlight was pure gold and the leaves were all brilliant scarlets and oranges, when the sound of late-season hammering came from the building work that was pressing forward on the edge of town, when the people he'd known his whole life smiled and waved and called greetings to him as he walked toward the lumber yard, it was difficult not to love Point Harrow with his whole heart, and not to dedicate the rest of his life to protecting and guiding his home. Sharon's desk was still empty. He stood and stared at it for a moment, then turned and went on to his own desk, his shoulders slumped and heart growing a little heavier with every step. Would she never return? Was it possible that she was waiting for him to come to her, all evidence to the contrary? No, he couldn't hunt her down in her little sanctuary. He had to trust that she would come and speak to him when she was ready. Besides, if he knew Edna Fuller, the mistress of the boarding house wouldn't even let him see her unless Sharon agreed to it. Edna was just as protective of her own as her old friend Bernice Cross. He was trying to plow his way through some papers when a knock came on the door, and he looked up to see the grinning visage of Hollis Carter. For a moment, he stared at him, mouth open in disbelief. "Are you really here, Carter?" "Large as life, Mr. Cross." "After I warned you in no uncertain terms about the river and the 12-foot plank?" Carter held his hands up as Daniel came out from behind his desk, approaching him with his own fists at the ready. "Now, hold on a moment, Mr. Cross. I assure you I'm not here out of sheer frivolity. I believe that you would, indeed, feel no compunction about introducing me to a 12-foot board, nor indeed to the chilly waters of the river. But I'm willing to make such a potential sacrifice for the good of Point Harrow." Daniel stopped a few feet away from the man, fists at his sides. "What are you talking about?" "Why, about our little business proposition, Mr. Cross. You never did give me a final answer. Of all the sheer gall, after I find you menacing my bookkeeper, you think that I'm going to make a business arrangement with a man like you?" "Oh, not with a man like me," Carter said, pressing a hand to his chest modestly. "But with Parson and Beam, yes, I should hope so. You see, I've gone and spoken with the council. Mr. Briggs was very helpful in pointing me in the right direction, and they all seem to agree that supporting Parson and Beam would be not only a boon for the town, but lucrative for all those involved." He grinned. "They're very smart about business, aren't they, your town council? I'm surprised, I must say. I half expected to find a bunch of yokels sitting around chewing on hay." For a blinding moment, Daniel considered the wisdom of carrying out his threat and dumping Carter in the river. Carter belonged in the river. He was fairly crying out for such a fate. Only the thought of what his mother would say stopped him from taking action. With a great effort, he managed to step back a few feet and regain his composure. "The council have been misled," he said. "I've heard a few stories of what happened to the towns where Parson and Beam opened up their mercantile. Tall tales told by jealous men, no doubt. Sheriff Conley has friends in faraway places, and I'd trust him with my life." Carter folded his arms and said, Daniel watched him, eyes narrowed. "I don't suppose there's any other way I could persuade you, then," Carter murmured at last. "Even if my employers agreed to pay you double the going rate for the lumber to build their little shop." "A bribe, now?" "Weak, Mr. Carter, that's what you are. Grasping at straws." He shook his head, feeling suddenly almost contemptuously amused at the man. "I reckon they won't be too happy when you come back and tell them that you failed in your little enterprise." "Oh, I won't fail, Mr. Cross. You see, I have an ace up my sleeve. It doesn't matter what you threaten me with, Carter. I know too much about your employers and their business. I could never agree to them coming into my town, not in good conscience." He didn't like the snake-like smile that appeared on Hollis Carter's face. "In good conscience, he said. "Funny you should mention that, all things considered." He didn't like the tone of his voice, either. "What are you talking about?" he said sharply. "It's ironic, that's all, hearing about the importance of a good conscience from a man who is so deeply involved with a married woman." Carter examined his nails with a semblance of disinterest. "I believe I even heard a declaration of love, as I left the premises. Fate really is too cruel." Daniel's heart seemed to come to a stop and simply shudder in his chest. "What are you talking about?" he said again. "Why, Sharon Shaw, of course. Have you been romancing any other married ladies I ought to know about? Her husband is dead. Carter grinned so widely that his eyes nearly disappeared. Nonsense, he said. You should never believe rumors, Mr. Cross. Sharon Shaw's husband is alive and well. Why, I saw him with my own eyes not 2 weeks ago. Daniel was scarcely aware of what happened after that. Everything seemed to blur together. He could not bring himself to speak to Carter again after the outrageous claim. At last, the salesman gave up with a sigh and left at last, declaring that he would speak to Daniel again when he was in a less discombobulated frame of mind. Left to himself, Daniel couldn't manage to face the papers that needed to be completed, the orders that were still spilling in, the letters of support from townsfolk. Didn't people know that winter was coming? That it was time to sit still and be quiet? He found himself knocking on the door of Edna Fuller's boarding house without any real memory of how he'd gotten there. But it was, after all, just down the street from his own home. Perhaps he ought to go there instead. Just go home, and tell his mother that his life was over, and go to bed. It was November, the evenings were brief, and already it was growing dark. But Edna had opened the door. She took one look at him and closed it again. He turned away, but before he could make it down the steps, the door opened once more and Sharon was there. Daniel? He turned to look at her, frowning in thought, and she stepped forward, seeming to catch her breath. He wondered dimly if her heart was racing as quickly as his own. I've been waiting for you to come and speak with me, she said quietly. I'm afraid I was too cowardly to take the first step. You deserve an explanation. Daniel let out a sigh from the depths of his soul. Yes, he said. I do. She nodded and sat down on the bench, looking up at him until he sat down beside her. For a long moment they sat in silence as she gathered her thoughts. At last, she gave a faint sigh and began. It isn't that I don't care for you, she said. I suppose a woman oughtn't to be so forward. I'm sure my mother would have something to say about it, but, when you kissed me, Daniel, it took all the strength I had not to hold on to you as tight as I could. It took all the strength I had to step away, but I could not bear the thought of misleading you, any more than I already have. It is true that I was married, and that a few years ago I was told that my husband had died in an accident. Buried in rock, his body never retrieved. I mourned him as best as I could, but I admit that I was glad. She shifted her weight, clearly uncomfortable with this honesty, and he put a hand on hers, swiftly. I think anyone would understand why, he said. That's why you didn't go home afterwards, isn't it? Your parents wanted you to marry him. Yes, she said quietly. I was enamored with him at first, he could be very charming. But just before our wedding, I saw a different side of him and begged my parents to let me come home. My father said it would bring shame on our family, my mother told me it was a woman's lot to bear. She shook her head. No, I couldn't go home. I was glad to have my freedom, after Cal died. After they told me he died. Another sigh, deeper this time, and he heard the pain she was feeling. A few months back, I started hearing rumors. Rumors that he hadn't died after all, that he had run afoul of gambling debts which he could not pay and faked his death in order to escape the hands of the law, and of those he owed. I had my suspicions, while we were together, but after he was gone, I was too grateful to ask any questions. When they told me that he'd been spotted, that the law was looking for him, well, I couldn't bear it. I was half afraid that he would come after me again, as some sort of protection. A way to hide. She drew her arms about herself, as though for comfort, and he fought back the urge to put his arm around her in turn. I don't know. Perhaps it didn't make any sense, not really, but I couldn't just sit there and wait for him to appear. I bought my ticket west, deciding to come somewhere far away, where he wouldn't know how to find me. Somewhere that I could start over. I didn't know that I was going to stay here. It was that first evening at Edna's boarding house that I decided I might try to make Point Harrow my new home. Do you remember it, Daniel? It was a beautiful autumn evening, and the stars were just coming out. I was sitting right here, and I looked across the road. And you saw me, he breathed, feeling simultaneously hollowed out and entirely full at the same time. That was what made you decide to stay? She smiled, just a little, but it was real. I thought perhaps there was something for me here, she said. Now he gave into his impulse to touch her. His hand found hers again and tightened on it. She wrapped her fingers around his, returning the pressure. What about Hollis Carter? Oh. She sighed. He was a salesman. Still is. A traveling salesman, back in the town in Ohio where I first settled down with Cal. When I knew him, he was selling shovels and pickaxes, Sharon said softly, bitterly. The sort that broke after a week or two, long enough that the miners didn't suspect him, short enough that they would be ready to buy another off him when he came around again the next month. He did a few rounds like that in the time I knew him, before someone got wise and chased him off. By then, though, he had made friends with Cal. Her mouth twisted. Kindred spirits, I suppose. It didn't say much about her husband, Daniel thought, if he was kindred spirits with the likes of Hollis Carter. How did he find you? She lifted one shoulder in a shrug. Happenstance, I suppose. He was as surprised to see me as I was to see him, but he was never the sort to pass up an opportunity to get ahead in whatever way he could. I don't know if he thought that Cal would reward him for bringing him word of me, or if he simply couldn't stand to see me escape for good. Whatever the case, he told me that my husband was still alive, that he was living well in Portland, and hinted that we would soon be reunited. She shuddered, and he pressed her hand more firmly. Sounds more like a threat than a hint, he said. I won't let that happen, Sharon. He abandoned you. As far as I'm concerned, that put paid to any obligation on your part, even if he is still your husband. But that's just it, she said softly. If he really is alive, Daniel, and I'm afraid that I believe Mr. Carter, for there's no reason for him to lie about that, then it doesn't matter whether I'm with him or not. I'm his wife, no matter where I am. I am still married, and I cannot love you. She pressed her lips together, luminous in the dark. No, that isn't true, that's not what I mean. I do love you, Daniel. But I shouldn't. And I can't marry you. He couldn't bring himself to speak. He wanted to object, to deny her words, but the truth of it was plain, and he knew that questioning it, trying to find a way around it, would only bring her further pain. There was nothing to be done, except feel the wave of longing and distress that crashed over him, mingling those murky waters in desperation. They sat together for a long time, in a silence born of misery and understanding, while the world darkened around them and time crept ever onward. Chapter 8. Time, historically, has been promised to heal all ills, but in this case, it did nothing but make the impossibility of the situation all the more clear. This was one wound that would not be calmed simply by the passing of the days. 10 days before the deadline by which he was meant to be married, if he wanted the backing of the council members, Daniel knocked on the door of Ronald Briggs' study and let himself in without waiting to be invited. The councilman himself was standing at his window, back to the door, and whirled around with a look of surprise on his face and a glass of whiskey, Daniel noted, halfway to his mouth. Daniel. Councilman Briggs, Daniel returned, nodding at him. I wasn't expecting. Dolly let me in. Oh. Ronald Briggs turned away from the window and took his seat, setting the glass of whiskey in an open drawer. She hates it when I drink the stuff, he said conspiratorially. Let's not say anything about it, eh? Not a word, Daniel promised. Come and sit down, Daniel. Actually, I'd rather stand, Ron. This won't take but a minute. He took his hat off and held it in front of him with both hands. His fingers were so tight on the brim that the tips were white. It was the right decision, he reminded himself. There was nothing else that could be done, if the council were unwilling to change their minds. This was his last chance. I came to ask you, once and for all, whether the council would be willing to bend on the issue of a bachelor mayor. Briggs raised his eyebrows at him. Now, Daniel, you know we've had this conversation time and time again. I know it, Daniel said shortly. It's a yes or no question, Councilman. Well, then, if you insist on putting it baldly, the answer is no. Daniel nodded briefly at him. All right, he said. Then you and the rest better get busy finding another candidate for mayor, someone you feel you can put your trust in, for I've changed my mind. I don't want the job, not if it means marrying someone I don't love. Oh, but Daniel. Daniel turned to go, and Briggs was at his heels, fairly floundering in his wake. Daniel, don't be like that, son. I know it's a little tricky, marrying a mail-order bride, but remember, there's every possibility that you might come to love her, if you give her a little time. Daniel paused on the threshold and glanced back, shaking his head determinedly. No, he said. I know what love is, and if I can't marry the woman I love, I won't marry anyone at all. I'll go back to my sawmill and be grateful of it. I'm as steady as the day is long, Ron, and you know it. The whole council knows it. If you can't work with me as I am, then I'll find other things to put my energies into. He put his hat back on, just to tip it at him, and swept out without another pause, ignoring Briggs' attempts to remonstrate. His heart was racing, and he felt a little sick. He had believed in the importance of taking on the role of mayor. He believed that he could do a lot of good for the town that he loved so much. But he would just have to do what he could in the capacity of the sawmill owner, that was all, rather than any figurehead. He wondered whether Pete would let him run the mill for a few days, just to clear his head. One thing was certain. He wouldn't marry someone who wasn't Sharon Shaw, and she seemed to be out of his reach. The last chance he had at finding anything out about her situation was to go to the one man he most wanted to avoid. Through bits and pieces of town gossip, Daniel had heard that Hollis Carter was staying at one of the rooms to let above the saloon. Breathing a prayer that he would succeed in keeping his temper as he spoke to the man, Daniel found his way to Carter's quarters and knocked. A long pause, and then that unctuous voice. Reba? Is that you? Daniel gritted his teeth. It's Daniel Cross. Oh. A brief chuckle, and then the door was flung open wide, and Carter grinned at him from the other side. A pleasant surprise. Come on in, Mr. Cross. Daniel did as he was bid, though he was already itching to punch that expression off Carter's face. This won't take long, he said. I only want to find out what you know about Cal Shaw. Carter tapped a finger to his chin, making a production of thinking deeply. Shaw, Cal Shaw, the name seems to slip my mind, oh. He snapped his fingers. That's right, my old friend Cal Shaw, whose wife happens to be in your employ as a bookkeeper. He beamed at him. Why, all I can tell you is what I told you before, he's alive and well, or at least he was the last time I saw him. Daniel folded his arms. Well? Well what? Carter shrugged. I'm sure he'll be pleased to hear that Sharon has been so faithful to him. He laughed. She was told he was dead, Daniel said, finding it increasingly difficult to keep his tone level. Shaw faked his death and ran away like a coward. What was she supposed to think? Carter shrugged one shoulder. I don't know, I'm sure. I suppose it might have been helpful if she'd bothered to look for the body, would have saved a lot of confusion, don't you think? Don't you dare make this out to be Sharon's fault. Carter tilted his head, eyeing Daniel for a moment. Suddenly, his face split in an almost unsettlingly wide grin. You really care about the girl, don't you? She didn't deserve to be treated the way Shaw treated her. And she doesn't deserve what you're doing, either. What does she deserve, then, Marriage to a solid, steady sawmill owner come mayor, is that it? Another dry chuckle. Well, of course that would be tricky, but I'll tell you what, Mr. Cross. Let it never be said that Hollis Carter turned a blind eye to true love. I'd be willing to help you out with a little secret about Cal Shaw, if you help me out in return. Daniel had a feeling that he knew what was coming. Parson and Beam, he said. Carter looked positively delighted. Why, I'm so glad you thought of it yourself. That's a very good sign. Daniel hesitated, feeling the world hanging in the balance. If he threw his weight behind the franchise operation, there was a good chance that it would go through, even if he was not the mayor. He was a well-respected businessman, and Parson and Beam would have to rely on his lumber to build their stores. If he agreed to it, Carter would tell him something. A secret. Something about Cal Shaw. But the price of the secret was the future of Point Harrow. And that was far too dear a price to pay. He shook his head. No, he said. I'll keep your employers out of my town if it's the last thing I do. The delight drained from Carter's face like water let out of a trough. It may not be your decision, of course, he said smoothly. Councilman Briggs seemed to think very kindly of my proposition. And, after all, you are not the mayor. I may not be mayor, I may never be the mayor, but folks look up to me, all the same, and my word carries weight in Point Harrow. More than yours ever will, Carter. More than the council's? Carter asked softly. Daniel took a deep breath, steeling himself to stay calm and strong. You don't belong here, Carter, he said. You never will. Long after you're gone, I'll still be here, looking out for the good people of Point Harrow. Nothing you can do will ever change that. He turned and left the salesman behind, square-shouldered and straight-backed. Unlike his earlier interview with Councilman Briggs, this man did not shout after him or try to get him to turn back. Instead, all he heard was a long, low chuckle, and the sound of the door closing softly. But something about what Carter had said stuck with him, and instead of returning home to complain to his mother, as he had figured on doing, he detoured down another block to the jailhouse, where John Conley sat inside swearing at a bulletin. Come on in, Cross, I could use a distraction. What luck, that's just about the only thing I have ready to hand. He recounted the conversation with Carter, briefly, ending it up with his suspicion. That secret he mentioned, he said. Do you reckon there's a way we can find out what it is, without his bribery? Sheriff Conley made a thoughtful face. He might well have just been talking through his hat, he said. A man like Hollis Carter wouldn't think twice about lying if he thought it would help his cause, or his employers, at least. But if I'd accepted it, he'd have had to come up with something then and there. If it was proven false, we'd easily have time to change the agreement before ground was broken for Parson and Beam. No, I think there might be something to it. Conley nodded. Where did he say this Cal Shaw is these days? He didn't tell me, but he told Sharon that he's livin' in Portland. The sheriff shrugged and reached for a piece of paper. I know a few lawmen in the area. Isn't too far away from here, I reckon I could send an inquiry and hear back within a few weeks. Daniel pressed his lips together. Couldn't make it within 10 days, could you? Conley raised an eyebrow. Now, that might only be possible through prayer, Cross. What's so important about 10 days from now? Daniel shook his head. Nothing, he said. Never mind, Conley. I'd already changed my mind about it, anyhow. You just get it back as quick as you can, and I'll owe you. The sheriff eyed him for a minute, then shook his head with a grin. No debt on your side, Daniel Cross, he said. I'd do it for a friend. Chapter 9. On the morning that his life had been due to change, Daniel arrived to his office in the lumber yard a little earlier than usual. He sat on the veranda in the still morning silence for a long few moments, all by himself, simply breathing in the air. It was cold enough, at 7:30, that he could see his breath. Winter was just around the corner. He wondered what the spring would be like, after the snows had melted off. Would the new year hold wonders for him, despite the trials and travails of this misbegotten fall? His mayorship, his wife, everything that he had expected to have by now, all of it was gone, and even the promise of such things to come was faint and imprecise. But he'd done what needed to be done, he told himself. He'd done what was right, by himself, by his mother, by the mill, by the town, and, he hoped, by Sharon Shaw. She was never far from his thoughts, and as though called into being by her name on his mind, she appeared around the corner. She glanced up and stopped for a few heartbeats, then came on again, a bit more slowly this time. He saw that she held an envelope clutched in one hand. Sharon. She stopped on the top step of the veranda, and he got to his feet to come to her. Rather than take his outstretched hand, she simply put the envelope into it. What is this? I'd hoped that you would be gone, still, she said quietly. I had thought it would be easier if I just left it for you, but I suppose that would have been cowardly of me. What is it, Sharon? He asked again, gently. She took a deep breath. It's my goodbye, she said. I tried to stick it out, Daniel, really, honest, I did. I thought that we would be all right, now that the words have been spoken. Now that you understand we can never be together. She put a hand to her forehead, a faint laugh escaping her. I don't know what I was thinking. Their eyes met, and once again he fought the urge to reach for her. She put her hands behind her back and squared her shoulders. That letter is my farewell, she said. I'm going to catch the next train. I know what you gave up because of me, Daniel, and I love you for it, even more. But I can't bear to see it every day, knowing that it doesn't matter, in the end. Knowing that you gave up the mayorship for nothing. Not for nothing, he said swiftly, and shoved the envelope in his pocket. Don't go, Sharon, wait a little longer. I'll stay away from the mill, if that will help. Sheriff Conley sent a telegram to Portland 10 days ago, to find out about Cal Shaw. If there's anything we can use against him, we will, and if there isn't, I plan to go up there myself and confront the man, demand that he give you a divorce. Sharon's gray eyes were wide with a strange mixture of pain and gratitude. Oh, Daniel, please don't do that for me. It isn't just for you, Daniel said, and he took her hands in his now, heedless of how she tried to step away. It's for me, too, you know. I guess I'm a little selfish, but by God, Sharon, I love you. A faint cough came from around the corner. Daniel dropped her hands hastily and Sharon stepped back, her cheeks flushed. And now here came Councilman Briggs, pretending avidly that he hadn't seen any of what had just transpired, though Daniel was willing to bet that he had. Daniel. Daniel sighed. Ron. Briggs avoided his gaze. I'm sorry to do this so early, but I couldn't put it off until later in good conscience. The council has met for the last time this morning and agreed that we will not give your mayorship our backing, due to previously aforementioned circumstances which were not fulfilled. Briggs' mouth pulled downward as though weighted by the length of his vocabulary, and he burst out rather more realistically, I'm sorry, Daniel, I really am. I tried to argue for you at the end, but we're all rather old-fashioned, in the council. Daniel shook his head. There's no need to apologize, he told the councilman. I know just what sort of men you are, you're good, faithful, strong-willed men who want the best for the town. It's just that you have a funny way of deciding what's important. He glanced back at Sharon, who met his gaze though her hands were trembling. Anyway, it doesn't matter much. Not as much as some things. Yes, well, I can see why you made your decision, I suppose, Briggs agreed, glancing at the young woman. Still, I can't help but regret. I don't, Daniel said. Now, Councilman, Mrs. Shaw and I were in the middle of a conversation, so if you don't mind. Briggs made wordless noises of understanding and a general intention to leave, but just as he turned, the sound of running feet came around the corner, followed almost immediately by John Conley. Daniel put a hand to his forehead, stifling a groan. It isn't even 8 o'clock, he muttered. Why is everyone here? Despite the gravity of the situation, he caught a small smile from Sharon. He smiled back, and for a moment, in the midst of the turmoil of the world, they felt as though they were entirely alone. Then reality crashed back in on them like a rogue wave. As seemed to happen all too often, everything was going on at once. Cross. Good morning, Sheriff, blustered Briggs. I hope there's nothing wrong. Conley pushed past the councilman, ignoring him entirely. Daniel got his first good glance at the sheriff and went still. There was something different about his old friendly enemy. Conley's narrow face was alight. He waved a folded yellow paper at Daniel. You must have been praying every day, he said. Or know who to pull strings with. The men in Portland sent me a telegram, and it's only been 10 days. Daniel felt his mouth go dry. At his side, Sharon went very still. What is it? They found Cal Shaw. Matter of fact, they had already had tabs on him for a while, for a sheriff from someplace in Ohio. Guess he ran up some debts and ran away, faked his death to escape. Left everything behind. Calmly nodded briefly at Sharon. And a bigger fool than Cal Shaw, I reckon I'll never encounter, Miss Sharon. Mrs. Sharon murmured, but there was a bitterness to it. Oddly enough, calmly grinned. Well, that's just it, he said. Turns out there were some other secrets that Cal Shaw was hiding, and once the law started poking, they found him quick enough. He'd only gone out to Ohio because he was running from other debts, from the years before. He was in Pennsylvania before that. Yes, that's where I met him, Sharon said. Well, men like Cal Shaw tend to stick to a pattern, the sheriff told her. And where they commit one sort of fraud and crime, they're likely to commit others. I hope it won't shock you too much, Miss Sharon, to find that your supposed husband was a crook on every level. And his first victim when he fled east to Pennsylvania was named Maria Shaw. Cal's wife. The world went very still. Daniel forgot to breathe for a moment, then remembered all of a sudden and hauled in a deep breath. He turned to Sharon, who was staring at the sheriff with her eyes wide and silvery. Do you mean? Bigamy is the word for it, the sheriff said gently. Among other things, that's liable to put him in jail for the rest of his natural life. He never was really married to you, ma'am, not in the eyes of the law. His poor first wife Maria was just as shocked to find out as I reckon you are, now, but she was quick enough to hand him over to the law without hiding him, and I reckon she'll get her own back in the end. Sharon turned to Daniel, very slowly. She reached out one hand as though she was blind, and he took it in both of his. I can't believe it, he said. Sharon's lips pressed together. I can, she said bitterly. And to think, all this time, when people called me miss, I've been correcting them. Daniel drew her a step closer to him and put his arm around her shoulders. Not for long, he breathed in her ear. Will you marry me, Sharon S.H., what is your maiden name? She blinked back tears as she turned to him, but she was smiling, too. Miller, she said. Sharon Miller. Daniel pressed a kiss to her mouth. Not for long, he said again, and turned to Briggs, who was still staring at them wide-eyed. Councilman, I realize that the deadline has elapsed. Briggs fairly fell over himself in his haste to make amends. Oh, for you, Daniel, we'd be happy to extend it a day or two, or a week, if you need. Yes, there must be time to make arrangements, and my wife would be only too happy to help out if you'd like, Miss Miller. Sharon wound an arm around Daniel's waist, and he turned his head to look down at her. How do you feel about being the mayor's wife? He whispered. She shook her head. It certainly isn't something I ever thought of for myself, she said. But, well, why do you want to be mayor, Daniel? Because I love this town, he said honestly. And because I think I can do some good for the people here. Sharon smiled and leaned up to press a kiss to his lips. I love Point Harrow, too, she said. I haven't been here long, but it's more of a home to me than anywhere else I've ever been. Do you think I could do some good for people, Daniel? I know it. Then I'm ready to be the mayor's wife, Daniel Cross. Whatever you decide to do, I'm there at your side. Daniel put both arms around her and hugged her tightly for a moment. When he let her go, he was grinning. Sheriff Conley. Conley grinned back. Yes, Mayor Cross. I don't suppose you could go and hunt down Hollis Carter, could you? I'd like a word with him, maybe even two. We have some unfinished business. What are you going to do? Sharon asked him as the sheriff moved off with a nod, the councilman following him. Daniel's eyes glinted in the sunlight. I'm going to tell him in no uncertain terms that Point Harrow will not accept his employer's enterprise, and to clear off out of here before the sun sets. He's a very stubborn man, Sharon said. Suppose he refuses? Daniel laughed. That's the best part about being a mill owner, he said. There's bound to be a 12-foot board around here somewhere. Arms tight around each other, they turned together and stepped up into the entryway of the office. The day was young, and there were plans to be made. The end. Thank you for listening to The Mayor's Forced Marriage by Susannah Calloway. You can be assured that all her books are clean and wholesome. To find other romances by Susannah Calloway, as well as the other authors at Tika House Publishing, visit www.tikahousepublishing.com. Remember to hit like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next Susannah Calloway Western romance.